Okay, the example I'm going to use is one from municipal government. The incident is real. It occurred in the early 1980s here in the city of Halifax, actually, as it was known then, before the advent of HRM. And it involved a collective bargaining between the city and the fire service and a fire strike that occurred here for nearly a month in the city. At that time, I was the director of labor relations for the city, reporting to the city manager, regular contact with council, and I worked very closely with the fire chief. The council and the city was faced with some dilemmas. The cost of fire service was increasing exponentially and dramatically. There was real concern about the financial sustainability of the fire service. And just as importantly, there were issues around firefighters refusing to do prevention, which in a city like Halifax was potentially a very dangerous situation. Because if the firefighters were not doing inspections, then there could be dramatic negative effects on the city's safety record. And so the city and the union became very embroiled in this dispute, with the union being very fixed in their position that they were not going to take any less salary, that they were not going to do these types of inspections, and the city adamant that they were. So the chief and I recognized that the possibility of strike existed. And the council had asked us for recommendations. And one of those recommendations was whether or not it would be appropriate to allow the strike to occur, because all of us were very much aware of the risk to the citizens of making that decision. So the chief and I engaged in a major review. He, of course, being the expert, did all of the analysis of the risk from a firefighting point of view. But we also traveled to cities like Montreal, where there had been previous fire strikes, and cities in the States, and talked to people about the level of risk and what had occurred. And we also looked at all of the different avenues to provide contingency services in the event of withdrawal of service. Well, we satisfied ourselves that it was possible to survive this type of dispute, and that there was a potential contingency plan that would work. We decided to make the recommendation to council that yes, the contingency plans could be put in place, and the city could probably survive a fire strike. However, we also recognized, and this is an important factor, that we were assuming a very short strike. We believed in our professional judgment, and I did as a professional negotiator, that once the strike occurred, the firefighters would in effect come to their senses, and that the strike would be limited in duration. Well, we got a surprise. We did recommend this. Council did accept our recommendations. The strike did occur. But instead of resolving quickly, the positions hardened. And 3 weeks was heading into 4. Very long. And although we had a contingency plan with backup military firefighters and resources, Citizens Watch, the chief came to me and said, "This is no longer viable. The risk is too great." And we were faced with the reality of the fact that we might have to go back, or we would have to go back to council and say, "We were wrong in our estimation of the time frame. Even though we gave you advice that the risk was doable, it's now extended beyond the proper risk, and we're recommending to settle." And we knew if we did that, there would be a lot of very disappointed, very angry council members. So we had to make a decision to do it. We decided that it was in the public interest to do it, because we were not prepared to make any further recommendations that would undermine and put at risk citizens. We made the recommendation. The reaction was exactly what we anticipated. We were very angry, very disappointed, felt misled by us as public servants, and we felt that the only way to get them to focus, because our focus had to stay on ensuring the public was protected and trying to convince council to settle the strike, the only way to do that, we concluded, along with our city manager who we were working with, that the best thing for us to do to probably impart to them the importance of how we felt about this was to offer to resign, which we did. At that moment in the meeting, and I can recall it quite dramatically, at that moment I think that decision that we made really imparted to the council and to the mayor of the day how serious the situation was and how concerned we were. And as a result of that, to make a long story short, the council did agree to give us a mandate to settle. We did work with the Industrial Inquiry Commission to settle, and we're very relieved when the settlement that we achieved actually did what we had felt all along we needed to do, and we did get the ability to do the inspections. We did end up with a financially sustainable agreement. Well, I think the most obvious one was at the beginning, and that is that whenever you're faced with the reality of competing difficulties, we were faced with trying to determine, you have a situation where you're concerned about financial sustainability of a service that's critical. You're also concerned about, of course, the fact that perhaps the job wasn't getting done to the standard that could protect the citizen on one hand, but yet at the same time having to choose between that and the risk of a full-blown strike to the immediate citizenry. That was a huge dilemma, whether to make the recommendation to go on strike at all. So that was the first, I think, quite a challenging moment. Having made that recommendation, however, the second challenge came, I think, when we recognized that the risk was too great. It was becoming too great. Having to make the decision of whether to worry about our own careers and council's potentially negative reaction by not telling them how we felt, or actually taking the responsibility and accountability of going to council, knowing it could put our careers at risk, and knowing that we would have some very angry and disappointed bosses, but going to them and saying, we were wrong in terms of our estimate of the length of time this risk would continue to be manageable, and we're now asking you to do the opposite to what we originally recommended you to do. Tremendous ethical dilemma then. And then the third ethical dilemma, of course, was involved around our decision to whether we should offer a resignation, and put aside our careers because we were so concerned about the ramifications on the general public, or whether we would hold on to our careers and hope for the best. So that was the third really strong ethical one. I think there are two things that I would have done differently, and I think if you spoke with the chief, and he and I chatted over the years about our decisions, and what we had done at that time, I think perhaps it's more wishful thinking than reality, but I think we would have perhaps done a little more homework in terms of our timing. I think there was a great deal of proper work done on the risk measurement, but I think we underestimated the tenacity of both sides in terms of the length of the strike. And I think that we didn't factor that into our initial assessments. So that would be one thing I would think do differently. I think, in retrospect, however, for the most part, I think the recommendations we made were sound. I still think it was necessary for us to recommend the withdrawal of that service, given the ramifications of not having done it. So, I think for public servants, it's easy to go back and see what's negative and see the mistakes. But I think, in fairness, you have to operate on the facts as you know them and on the circumstances that you're faced with. And while I think it's good to go back and do a postmortem on these events, I also think you have to be realistic that the world changes, and so looking back 20 years is difficult. But I would say that would be the main change I would make. That's a tough question. What I would say to young public servants coming in is what I always said, I think, to all my staff in the public service, and that is that when you come into the public service, always remember, no matter how short or long your career is, every recommendation you make ultimately has an impact on someone and on citizens. whatever that recommendation is, it leads to some decision somewhere in the public service that impacts on the lives of people. And I think if you remember that, the police have the mantra to serve and protect. It's always about serving and protecting citizens. It's always giving the best level of service. And I think if you focus on that and understand why you're there, that is critical. So that's the first comment I'd make. And the last comment I'd make is that no man is an island, no woman is an island. And remember, too, in the public service that there is the public servant and there is the elected official. And I think it's very, very important to understand that these ethical dilemmas occur not just for the public servants, but they also occur for the elected officials. And that this is a joint effort of managing. People elect their elected officials to do what they feel is right, and public servants is there to support and work with elected officials. So I sometimes think public servants tend to be a little too hard on the elected politicians. So I think it's respect for the process, respect for the electorate, and if you maintain, the focus on the public and what's in the public interest, you recognize what you're there for, and you don't lose sight of that, you'll be an excellent public servant.